You keep asking Allah to show you the truth. But have you ever considered that the truth cannot enter a heart that is still full? You want clarity, but you are not empty enough to receive it. You want direction, but your hands are still holding things you have not admitted you are afraid to lose. And so the silence continues. Not because Allah is withholding, but because you are still crowded. This is the part almost nobody talks about. We treat spiritual emptiness like a punishment, like something went wrong, like Allah has stepped back and left us confused on purpose, out of anger, out of distance. But what if the emptying is not abandonment? What if it is preparation? What if the very confusion you are sitting in right now is not the absence of guidance, but the beginning of it? Stay with me here, because this idea will quietly rearrange something in you before this video ends. There is a reason the great teacher Abdul Qadir Jilani spent so much of his life speaking about the heart as a vessel, not as a fortress, not as a trophy case, a vessel. And a vessel can only receive what it has room for. His teaching, as it has come down through generations of students who studied his gatherings, often circled around one central idea, that the seeker is not elevated by what he accumulates, but by what he is willing to release. Faqr, this radical spiritual poverty, was never about having empty pockets. It was about having an empty grip. Watch yourself carefully here. Because right now, as you listen to this, some part of you is already making a list of what you have, your effort, your knowledge, your good intentions, your years of trying. And that list, quietly, without you noticing, has become the very wall standing between you and the truth you are asking for. Let me show you what this looks like in an ordinary life, because this is not abstract philosophy. This is Tuesday afternoon. A man prays 5 times a day. He reads about spirituality. He watches videos exactly like this one. And still he feels nothing. No presence, no peace, no answers. He assumes Allah is testing his patience. But if he sat quietly and observed his own heart, he might notice something uncomfortable. He is not actually asking to be changed. He is asking to be confirmed. He wants the truth to arrive and agree with the person he has already decided he is. He wants revelation, but only the kind that fits inside the identity he has already built. This is the hidden strategy of the nafs. It rarely resists spirituality directly. It is far too intelligent for that. Instead, it disguises itself as spirituality. It lets you pray, fast, read, reflect, and quietly turns all of it into decoration. A performance for yourself, and sometimes without your awareness, a performance for others. The self does not mind being religious. It only minds being emptied. Here is where the teaching becomes uncomfortable. Because emptying is not the same as improving. Improving still leaves you in charge. Emptying requires you to stop being in charge. Think about the last time your life did not go according to your plan. Not a small inconvenience, something that actually disturbed the architecture of your identity. A relationship that ended without explanation. A door that closed after years of effort. A version of yourself that quietly died because reality refused to cooperate. What did you feel in that moment? Not sadness only, something deeper. A kind of disorientation, as if the ground beneath your sense of self had been pulled away. That disorientation is not a malfunction. It is the exact spot where truth tries to enter. And it is the exact spot most people run from. There is an old image worth sitting with. Picture a man who has spent his entire life guarding an empty house. Every night he checks the locks. Every morning he inspects the walls. He tells visitors how valuable the house is, how much it means to him, how carefully he protects it. But if you were to walk inside, you would find nothing there. No furniture, no light, just rooms he has never actually entered, because he has been too busy standing outside, guarding the idea of the house. Sit with that image for a moment before I explain it. Many of us are guarding houses we have never actually lived in. We guard the idea of our own goodness, without ever entering the discomfort of real self-examination. We guard the idea of our own faith, without ever surrendering the specific attachment that faith is supposed to dissolve. We become experts at protecting an image of ourselves that we have never actually inhabited. This is precisely where Faqr changes the entire question. Faqr does not ask you to build a better house. It asks you to stop guarding the door long enough to walk inside and see what is actually there. And what is usually there, underneath the fear, underneath the performance, is a kind of emptiness we have spent years trying not to face, because we were taught, quietly and wrongly, that emptiness is failure. But notice what your mind is doing right now. It is probably trying to turn this into a lesson you can apply later, a concept you can file away, so you do not have to feel the discomfort of it in this exact moment. That too is the nafs at work. It survives by postponement. It says, yes, this is important, I will sit with this properly later. And later never comes. Because the self does not actually want to be emptied. It wants to admire emptiness from a safe distance, Let's go deeper into why this emptying feels so unbearable. Attachment is not simply about loving something too much. Attachment is about outsourcing your sense of safety to something outside of yourself. A person checks their phone constantly, refreshing, waiting, needing a reply, and it feels like anxiety about a message. But underneath it is something older. A fear that without this response, without this confirmation, some part of their identity will collapse. The phone is not the attachment. The need to feel secure through something external is the attachment. A person earns more money and strangely becomes more afraid, not less. More afraid of losing it, more calculating, more guarded. This confuses people because they assume security comes from accumulation. But security was never supposed to come from accumulation. It multiplies the number of things that can be taken from you. Every possession becomes another thread tying your peace to something outside of Allah's unseen hand. This is what Abdul Qadir Jilani's students described him returning to again and again in his teaching gatherings, not a rejection of the world, but a warning against letting the heart quietly hand over its dependence to anything other than the one who does not change, does not disappear, does not run out. Here is a question worth sitting with, and do not answer it too quickly. If everything you currently rely on for your sense of worth was taken from you tonight, your achievements, your reputation, the way people see you, even your certainty about your own spiritual progress, who would be left? Do not rush past that. Most people skip this question because the honest answer is frightening. It reveals how much of what we call self is actually borrowed. Borrowed approval, borrowed comparison, borrowed identity built from other people's opinions of us. There is a striking parallel here in Kabir's poetry. Though his path and his framework are entirely his own, separate from the Islamic tradition, he often pointed toward the strangeness of a person searching desperately for what they are already standing in the middle of, blind to it because they are too consumed with performing the search itself rather than actually looking. It is a different tradition, a different theology entirely, but the psychological observation echoes something true. Much of our searching is actually avoidance dressed up as devotion. Now return to the title of this very video. Why does Allah empty you before revealing the truth? Because the truth is not information. It is not a fact waiting to be delivered to an unchanged heart. If it were merely information, intelligence would be enough to receive it, and the most educated among us would be the most spiritually awake, which we all know is not true. The truth Sufism speaks of is a presence, not a sentence. And presence cannot be added to a heart that is still full of noise, still full of self-protection, still full of the exhausting project of managing your own image before Allah and before others. This is why the emptying often arrives disguised as loss. A person loses a relationship and suddenly feels their entire identity has disappeared, as if the floor gave way beneath them. This feels like devastation, and it is devastating. Nobody should minimize that pain. But underneath the grief, something else is quietly happening. For the first time in years, that person is not performing. They are not managing anything. They are simply, terrifyingly, present with what remains when the borrowed identity is gone. That space, however unbearable it feels, is exactly where Faqr begins. Not as a concept in a book, but as a lived, involuntary confrontation with your own dependence. Here is a small practice, and it is not complicated, though it is uncomfortable. Tonight, sit in silence for a few minutes, without your phone, without a plan, without preparing what you will think about. Simply notice the first thing your mind reaches for to fill the silence. That thing, whatever it is very likely connected to what you are still relying on instead of Allah. Do not judge it, just notice it. Awareness in this tradition is always the first act of surrender. A second practice. Ask yourself honestly, if nobody could ever know about your goodness, would you still do the same good deeds in the same way? Sit with the discomfort of that question, rather than answering it quickly to protect your self-image. The honesty of your hesitation is more valuable than a confident answer. A third practice, closer to what was emphasized in Abdul Qadir Jilani's teaching on constant remembrance. Throughout your day, quietly ask yourself, in this exact moment, am I relying on Allah? Or am I secretly relying on my own control of the outcome? You may say the words, I trust Allah, while your mind is simultaneously working overtime to engineer every possible result. Notice the gap between the words and the actual state of your heart. That gap is not shameful. It is simply where the real spiritual work begins. Now we arrive at what this entire video has been circling. The emptying you have been resisting is not Allah taking something away out of punishment. It is Allah making room. You cannot hold the ocean in a cup that is already full of rainwater you have been proudly collecting for years. Every attachment, every borrowed identity, Every performance of goodness you have been maintaining for the approval of others. These are not evil, but they are occupying the space that was meant to be filled with something infinitely larger. There is an image worth carrying with you after this video ends. A drop of water, sitting at the edge of the ocean, terrified to enter. It believes that entering means disappearing. It clings to its shape, its edges, its sense of being a separate, defined thing. It does not yet understand that what feels like disappearing is actually the moment it stops being a small, isolated drop and becomes part of something without limits. The fear of losing the self is often mistaken for the fear of losing everything. But what actually happens, in the language of the mystics, is that the small, anxious, constructed self dissolves into something vast enough to finally hold peace. This is what the emptying was always preparing you for. Not nothingness, not punishment, not abandonment. Room. Room for a truth too large to fit inside a heart still furnished with fear, control, comparison, and the exhausting need to be seen as whole. You were never being punished by the silence. You were being cleared, slowly, patiently, sometimes painfully, so that something real could finally be placed inside you instead of something borrowed. So here is the question to carry with you, quietly, long after this video ends. What are you still holding on to, so tightly, so instinctively, that Allah cannot yet place the truth where your hands currently are? Do not answer that quickly either. Let it sit with you tonight, in the silence, when there is nothing left to perform and no one left to impress. If something in this video touched a place you recognized in yourself, share it in the comments. Not to explain it perfectly, just to name it honestly. Sometimes naming the emptiness is the first quiet step toward what it was always meant to hold.